Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. All right. Welcome, come on in. Grab a seat. All right, let's get started. As you can see from the title, in this session, we are going to be talking about the Aria Automation REST API. Usual disclaimer, that's me. My name's Brian Watrous. Just a brief background on me. This is my 19th year at VMware, and in my years at VMware, I've always been interested in the variety of different automation technologies that we provide, such as Orchestrator, Power CLI, Aria Automation, and so forth. So join me on this journey in automation. We have a very packed agenda here. This session was when I wrote it, I actually intended it to be taught over a longer period of time than I have allotted here today. So what I'm going to do is cover as much as I can. If the stars all align, we'll cover everything. But if I don't get through everything, I have some resources available for you, some videos that you can watch to get a much more complete view of all the stuff that we're talking about. So in the beginning, we'll just get started with a little bit of level setting to make certain that we understand a few core concepts. Then I'm going to show you how to locate and how to use the API documentation for the Aria Automation REST API. Then we're going to talk about how that Aria Automation REST API supports different versions and why that matters to you, followed by a discussion about how to authenticate to the Aria Automation REST API. And then, as an example, I'm going to show you how you can use that REST API. Once you've gotten authenticated, you can use that REST API to perform all sorts of automated operations. The example we're going to be looking at is how to do things related to blueprints. I will stick around afterwards. Again, I've got a lot of material here. If you can save your questions, I'll stick around. There's a water cooler right behind that column. I'll stick around and answer whatever questions you have, but let's get through what we can here. So to get started, welcome, come on in. We are going to quickly go through a few basics, starting with the notion of what is this thing called Aria Automation? Well, the very first thing I should do here, according to the powers that be, is to stop calling it Aria Automation. If you went to the general session, you know that I'm now supposed to call it VCF Automation, which for me is a good thing. I actually like that rebranding to simplify our product line. It gets a little confusing when you have Aria Automation, then you've got vSphere. It's nice to have everything under one umbrella. So you're going to get to see me live for the very first time trying to say VCF Automation. If I don't, my buddy Joel here will slap me around. He's here also, by the way, to drag me off the stage when my time is up. He'll drag me over to the water cooler behind the column, and we can answer whatever questions. So what is VCF Automation? VCF Automation is a technology from VMware that enables you to create your own private cloud. It can do much more than what I'm about to describe, but that's a good place to start. You want to create a private cloud? This can enable you to do it. It does so through these things called VCF Automation templates. As you can see, a VCF Automation template is written in YAML. And in this particular example, if you look at lines 3 through 15, you can see that this template, if a user requests a deployment from it, this template's going to deploy one vSphere virtual machine and plug that virtual machine into a network. Now, we can do much more than just that with these things called templates. With the VCF Automation template, if you want to, we can deploy other types of vSphere objects, such as disks, or we can deploy in the version of Aria Automation. I said that intentionally. The version of Aria Automation that you see in my slides also allows you to deploy public cloud machines, such as AWS, Azure, GCP. With these templates, you can deploy Kubernetes clusters and Kubernetes namespaces and load balancers and this and that and tons of things. So if you learn how to create these templates, it's going to open up a world of possibilities. VCF Automation, how'd I do there? VCF Automation provides a graphical user interface, as you would expect. and a command line interface, but we're here today to talk about its application programming interface. Let's do it. A little bit of terminology here. What we now, as of today, call an Aria Automation template used to be originally called a blueprint. And as you can see, we changed the name several times along the ways because we're VMware, we love changing names. But the reason why I put this slide up here in front of you is if you're going to use the VCF Automation API, you need to know the word blueprints. Because even though publicly we've gone through all these different names, the API has always called them blueprints. Next slide. This is just the progression of product names. For our purposes here, even though that's 3 different names, these are all the same thing. So if you happen to see something like VRA in my slide or Aria Automation, we mean VCF Automation. REST servers operate on top of HTTP or HTTPS. As you know, HTTP was originally defined by RFC 2616, and that document, if you haven't read it, it's a great read. It defines what an HTTP request looks like and what an HTTP response looks like. And that document also defines the different HTTP methods, such as get and put and post and delete. We'll talk a bit about those. And additionally, we're going to talk about status codes. If this sounds foreign to you, either reading RFC 2616 or if you like to see videos about this, you can learn this background information. But I'm going to assume that you either know it or can just sort of roll with it as we go through these slides. By the way, speaking of status codes, everyone's favorite status code, 404, file not found. So I know you know status codes. You may not know it, but you know them. The 200 series status codes mean good. 400 status codes mean that the client did something bad. 500 series code means the server did something bad. For our purposes, that's all you need to know. Whenever I start working with a new REST API, I generally go through these steps. Step number 0 is I've got to understand how to manually interact with the thing that I want to automate. If I don't know how to use the technology in a manual fashion, I'm probably not going to be able to automate it. So step 0, make certain you know the system that you're automating. Make certain you can do it manually through its GUI. Then in step number 1, whenever I'm working with the new REST API, I go look for the API documentation. Sometimes you'll discover there is none. Fortunately, with VMware is really good about providing API documentation. And I'm going to show you how to get to that. The first thing I look at in that documentation is what kind of authentication mechanism is this REST server using? Because if I can't authenticate, there's very little I'm going to be able to do through that API. Next, I'll read through the documentation to find out what REST operations that REST server supports. And then step 4, practice, 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 practice. Before I start automating things and pointing my automation at a production environment and destroy it, I got to practice this stuff first. So to practice, before I write a line of code in C or before I use Python or whatever your favorite language is, I always use some sort of REST client to get the practice that I need. I'll either use curl alongside JQ, or my personal preference is to use Postman. If you want to download a copy, go to postman.org. But using one or the other, I can interact with the API without having to deal with all the underlying programming itself. API documentation. To know how to use REST server, you don't just guess your way through it. You read the documentation. developer.broadcom.com is where you can go to find the API documentation for loads of different VMware by Broadcom technologies. Alternatively, if you use the URL displayed here, if you go to HTTPS followed by your VCF automation server's IP address or FQDN / automation-UI / API-documentation, that'll take you here. This VCF automation REST API I keep talking about is actually a collection of multiple APIs, each focused on a different part of what VCF automation does. So if you want to automate things such as the service catalog, go into the catalog section. If you want to do things with the deployments, go to where's the deployments hiding. What I'm going to be focusing on, we don't have time to talk about all this, but we could go take a look in this blueprint section, shall we? So in the blueprint section, or any of these other sections, when you open them up, it's going to start out looking like this. The first section here is talking about different parameters that you can add to all the operations that we're about to talk about. These particular parameters allow you to say things like, hey, VCF automation, instead of just, I want a list of blueprints, parameters like those allow you to narrow it down and say, I only want to see a subset. So don't show me all 100+ VCF blueprints. Use these parameters to say, just show me 20, or just show me 1. As you scroll down in this documentation, the next section shows you different categories. Each of these categories is used to organize the gazillion different REST operations I'm just about to show you. Let's go into this blueprint section and see what we can do there. But when we go into that blueprint section, there's a whole bunch of colorful entries here. Each of those is a different REST operation that we can send to the VCF automation server to tell the VCF automation server to do something. Let's look at this first one. The first one, you'll notice, begins with one of those HTTP methods. In this particular case, it's the HTTP method called get. The get method is used whenever you want to get some sort of object back from whatever type of server you're talking to. So if we do a get followed by a URL, the URL, specifically they're called endpoint URLs, is going to identify exactly what we want the server to do. So let's dig down deeper and see this. So we're going to do a get, and our endpoint URL in this case here is /blueprint /API/blueprints. There are going to be a lot of URLs flashing by on the screen here. I don't have time to talk about each one, but you now know where you can go to look up what they each do. So let's open up that particular REST operation and see the detailed information it provides us. So for this first REST operation, the parameters tab is going to describe all the different parameters that we can add to that or append to that endpoint URL to tweak exactly the way we want the operation to behave. For example, we have some other parameters here, like the ones we saw before. These will allow you to zero in on just the blueprints that you want to look up. If we scroll down, here's some more parameters. If you wanted to look up just a specific blueprint with a specific name, you could use the name parameter. Continuing to scroll down, the next one I want you to see that we're going to be talking about in a bit here is the one called API version. You don't need to know what it is right now, but you're going to learn momentarily. So all the different parameters supported by this REST operation are documented here for you to see. In the next section of the documentation, labeled responses, this is going to tell you what you're going to get back from the VCF automation server. You're going to get back a response that contains essentially two things: a status code and a response body. Now, one of the responses that you could receive, according to this documentation, is a status code 200. 200 is good. That means the request succeeded. So therefore, we can look at the response body, which is this stuff down here. In this particular case, this response body is in JSON format, but if I wanted to, I could say application/XML or potentially other formats. We're just going to look at JSON here throughout the rest of the session. But what this part of the documentation is telling you is that when you send this REST request, it's going to send back information about how many blueprints there are and other info. But I want to zero in on this content section. That content property has a bunch of sub-properties that tell you all sorts of things about a blueprint, including what is the ID of this blueprint? What is the name of this blueprint? What project is this blueprint associated with? And so forth. Now, it's great when you get back a 200, but you're not always going to get a 200 status code. You might get a 400, you might get a 401, you might get a 403. The documentation is telling you here what they each mean. I'm most interested right now in that 401, because we're going to start getting some 401s if we don't learn how to authenticate. So that's a quick look at the documentation. Let's explore this concept of API versions. Your VCF automation server has a REST API that supports multiple versions. Single server supporting multiple API versions. The reason why we do that is when you write your REST client, at times it's useful for you to be able to lock down that client to a specific API version. So what you're looking at here is that Postman REST client that I was talking about before. In this Postman client, I have defined a gazillion different REST operations in these things called collections. If you'd like to get your grubby little paws on these collections, if you go to that QR code, it'll take you to the same video series. Somewhere in the 60 or so videos, there's a bunch that are specifically about Aria Automation's REST API. So you can get these collections that I'm showing you here. So I long ago created a collection called VRA8. Again, that's VCF automation. In there, I created some subfolders to organize my REST operations, including I have this folder called About. Let's open up About and see what's in there. Well, I have defined two operations. The first one's called Get API Info. So let's select that and see how it's defined. Each one of these REST operations that I'm defining and showing you is going to have an HTTP method followed by an endpoint URL, followed by maybe some parameters. Again, you know where to look in the documentation to understand why I use each of these endpoint URLs. Now, I could hard code my VCF automation server's IP address or host name here, but frequently we want to use Postman variables. Every time you see something formatted like this in this session, that's a Postman variable. You can look up the values of the Postman variables by going to environments. So far, we've got the HTTP method and the endpoint URL that's going to tell the server we want to know what API versions it supports. Now, there's a bunch of tabs down below, such as this params tab, allows us to define what parameters we're going to add to the endpoint URL. In this case, we don't need any fancy parameters. The authentication tab is irrelevant for this particular operation because this is one of the few operations in the VCF REST API that does not require authentication. But we'll see an example of authentication coming up here shortly. The authorization section here is blank, but that will change in others. In the header section, we can define different headers, little pieces of information that are going to instruct the REST server what exactly we're trying to do here. For right now, you'll notice there's a header called accept. The accept header allows you to tell the server what format you want data returned to you in. Here we said */*, but we could have said something like application/JSON to get that formatted data. The body tab in general is used when you need to send a payload of data to the REST server. This operation doesn't require body, so we're going to leave it blank. So let's look at the body. It's blank. We'll see a body in a moment, though. The scripts tab we're going to see in more detail in a bit, but the basic idea behind the scripts tab is you can run JavaScript code before the REST request gets sent. That's a pre-request. That's a pre-request. A post response is a JavaScript chunk of code that gets run after your operation's done. And settings. I happen, in this lab environment, happen to be using self-signed certificates, so I moved the position of this first slider switch to tell it to shut up about the self-signed certificates. So you fill out the HTTP method, the endpoint URL, and all these different tabs. And when you're ready, you click the send button. So that's going to send this operation to the REST server, VCF Automation, and we're going to get back a response. The very first thing we check every single time is the status code. I got back a status code 200. That's good. Therefore, this response body is going to contain what I think it does. If I got back a 404 or others, I'm not going to go looking in the body. But let's look at this body. Kind of squinting here. Why don't we click on that little handy button there? That's the copy button. I'm going to copy and paste that response body into Notepad++, because Notepad++ does color coding, and it allows me to collapse and expand different sections. You don't have to use Notepad++. You can use whatever you want, or just use Postman. But here's the response body. So in this response body, we have a property called supported APIs. It has two sub-properties, or two sub-elements, defining two different API versions that this VCF automation server supports. Plus, there's another property down the bottom called latest API version. So I now have all the information that I need to know about the versions that this particular VCF server supports. If I somehow save this information away in a Postman variable, I can have every subsequent REST operation hit whatever API version I want. So the script code that you see here, let's zoom in on it. In this case, is a post response script written in JavaScript. And essentially what this code is saying on line number 3 is when we say data dot, that means go into the response body. Data dot latest API version means go find that piece of data, get its value, and do something with the value. In the case of line number 3, we're using a Postman method that's going to put that value into a Postman variable called this. So I'll just add this variable to all of my subsequent URLs, thereby tying the operations to the latest API version. That was an operation that does not require authentication. Most do. So to do authentication in VCF Automation, you need to get 2 tokens. One's called an API token. The next is called an access token. So again, in the collections that you can get by going to the video series I showed you, the first operation that we have here is going to get the API token. What it's going to do using this URL and the various tabs that we're setting up here is it's going to get us our first token. In order for this to work, you need to set the body to contain your credentials. So you got to set username, password, domain to whatever you would have typed if you're logging into the GUI. I could hard code those values, but as you can see, I've set these up as variables. Again, you can go to environments to see what those values are. So when you run this, you're going to get back a response. Check the status code. You're going to get back a response that contains the first of the 2 tokens. This code is storing that token in the Postman variable called API token. Now we need to get the second token. The first token is the input to get the second token. To get the second token, we're going to use this operation, which ultimately needs you to pass into the response the request body, you've got to pass in that token that you just got. And what you're going to get back in the request and the response body is the actual token. This is the token that you're going to use in all subsequent requests. Now, he's about to drag me off the stage. Again, I have happily answer any additional questions you have. We'll take them offline. I will put on the screen again the QR code that you can go to find out this information and much more in detail. Again, I'm happy to stick around and answer questions. But two last things before I get dragged off the stage. There is the issue of surveys. So please do consider doing your survey, where you can win exciting prizes. By the way, speaking of exciting prizes, talk to me afterwards at the water cooler. I've got some tokens for you. And additionally, if we go way back to the beginning, again, that URL will take you to a collection of 60 plus videos that go into this subject matter in great detail. He hasn't dragged me off the stage, but I know he's gonna. What are we doing? Gotta go? Gotta go. So again, I'll meet you off stage. Thank you everyone for attending. Have a great VMware Explorer.